You're listening to The Streaming Wars, the podcast that discusses all of the latest happenings regarding your favorite streaming services. Find out which service is winning the war this time around.
Hello everyone and welcome to the latest episode of The Streaming Wars. I'm Dustin, Tony is with me, and we are here to cover everything from the world of streaming from November 4th through November 10th. There's just a little bit of news because if you are living here in the United States, as I predicted last week, there is a extreme lack of news because the news was focused on the election and everything that the fallout from the election and things like that. And that, therefore, it was a very slow week. Actually, at the end of last week, I was gathering up stuff and articles as I do, because I do that about twice a week for the show. And there was, I want to say, over the course of half the week, there was only 3 or 4 news stories that popped up. But there was hardly any trailers that released at the end of last week from any of the services. It doesn't matter who. It's just because obviously all the focus last week was on the election. However, this week picked up and there's a little bit more news, and I've come across a couple more articles that were worth a little bit more discussion, some data related to some of the films that have released recently on a bunch of the streaming services, which ones are doing really well, as well as some Q3 results from some of the companies. So let's get into the news. Starting off with Netflix. Netflix has decided to launch a linear style channel as a test in France. Now, if you're not familiar with what a linear channel is, basically Peacock, Pluto TV, all of the, Tubi, a lot of these, they have exactly what they're talking about, linear style television, where basically they air things at specific times and you will be able to watch them as they're already in progress. And then obviously, because you already have the service, you could go then and find the service. But the idea is it gives a consistent level of content throughout the day for you to find instead of having to necessarily search. And it's just another way for Netflix to try to figure out ways of having people find the content they have available on their service.
This is a really, I feel like, radical idea for Netflix, just because they've never delved into this idea. Obviously, they do a lot with like recommendations and trying to optimize that better, but I've never seen an idea like this pretty much on any streaming service, unless it's like Hulu TV or YouTube TV, when it's actually streaming actual, channels. So I'm curious about this whole entire experiment. I'm curious if it's going to drive, viewership. It's going to drive how many hours that somebody just watches content. I don't know. There's just so many different things here, and just so curious how this is going to affect Netflix's bottom line. If this is a small scale test, well, I mean, it's France, it's not small scale, but if this is just a test for a local market, are they going to bring it, to all of Netflix as a whole? There's so many questions. It's so interesting of an idea on a streaming service. I'm also curious, is it just like going to be like the one Netflix channel where it's just going to be content, or is it going to be like different channels for potentially like documentaries or, food shows or, something like that? Because that would be a cool way to get more people involved with some of these other shows that are not necessarily like big hits, and they can watch content. There's some people that just put on the food channel just to have a break and just to watch something. Sometimes people don't know what documentary they want to watch. You just turn on the documentary channel and just find something that's going on. So overall, this is a pretty cool idea, and I'm curious how it's going to go in the future.
All right, so then moving over to Prime Video, Amazon has bought the film Palm Springs for multiple international markets. You may recall earlier this year, Palm Springs was actually purchased by Hulu, and they actually premiered it earlier this year on their service. This was a Sundance film that garnered a good chunk of money. I believe it was $18 million or something like that. But there was a lot of money, and Amazon has actually now decided they're going to purchase the rights for a lot of the international markets, including Australia, Canada, Netherlands, the UK, France, among others. All right, nothing for Hulu this week. Paramount Plus, there's a bunch of different things because Viacom CBS had their Q3 results. First of all, with their results themselves, they have been having a massive uptick when it comes to their streaming services between their ownership of Pluto TV as well as increased subscriptions for CBS All Access and Showtime. Streaming has been good for them, which explains some of the other stories we're going to talk about. But as far as Q3 results, what did you think?
I was going to say positive, but really there's some mixed results. So if you care about Viacom CBS as an entire company, it's definitely hit and miss. There are some product lines of theirs that definitely lost a lot of money due to COVID, or just due to the changing landscape in general of how people are moving away from, traditional TV to streaming, but this has definitely been exacerbated by, COVID-19. They've had some production halts for a long time due to states implementing different things. So you had a lot of big name TV shows that were put on pause, like NCIS. There was some new law show with some judge that I know has gotten a lot of attention recently. And so they've put that on the back burner as well. So you have these projects that do drive a lot of viewership of pretty stable demographics that they have to put on pause. So you definitely saw you saw some loss in terms of advertising revenue and stuff like that. Paramount as a film, the film company, it has definitely struggled due to COVID, which makes, complete sense of everything. They've definitely tried to recoup some of that money by selling, different properties to streaming services. We definitely mentioned that about a month or two ago of how Apple TV is specifically, how they've been one of the biggest ones shelling out a lot of money to these to these, film companies, film producers, recoup for Apple TV to get some content, but then for, places like Paramount to recoup some of their costs. So they detailed some of that, but for the purposes of this show of, CBS All Access, it will, we all know that's going to turn into Paramount Plus, but, they detailed that CBS All Access, revenue grew a lot more users using the service. So overall from that part of the company that I know we definitely care about, that definitely increased. Now, so to quote, just to bring in a quote, domestic streaming and digital video revenue rose 56% to 636 million, with subscription streaming revenue jumping 78%. And Pluto TV's advertising revenue more than doubling. So I probably didn't do it justice 5 seconds ago. This is great. These are great numbers. And so this is great for, CBS All Access as it moves forward, Paramount Plus, and then also Pluto TV, doubling advertising revenue. That's great. What are your thoughts on this?
When it comes to, obviously overall as a company, it's been rocky, but obviously they're a media company. So they're going to have problems right now because of COVID. However, I will say that overall, when it comes to streaming though, I think the thing is, even though CBS All Access in some ways is a mutation into what will be Paramount Plus, because it'll include a lot of the same things, but it'll also include a lot more from the larger company side of things. I think the biggest thing is because they're kind of launching this later in the game, they've been able to watch and see what everybody else has been doing and seeing what's been really successful. And they've learned that sports news, that's something that's really successful. They've announced that they have every intention of having news and sports available on the service, just like CBS All Access already allows people to use. I think the thing is, when it comes to them, they've realized that streaming is very important. They need to get Paramount Plus right. They can tell that between COVID, the, pay TV situation with just their various options that they have, because obviously CBS themselves, their core is on broadcast. They have their own problems to deal with. A lot of Viacom's companies that they brought to the table are on cable, and cable, as we know, has been slowly dying. And because of that, there is you're going to be making less money off of those networks than you once were. So the thing is, they're looking at streaming and saying, okay, this is our opportunity to get this right, because we need to basically navigate towards a direction for the company that has streaming as a huge focus. Now, this obviously isn't the first one. We've been talking about AT&T and Warner Media. That is, they've been basically pivoting. NBC Universal, to a degree, has been pivoting, even though Comcast is a huge player in the cable TV market. Overall, there's a reason why these large companies that have media as their focus are changing the path and making sure that streaming is a huge focus for them, because that's where they have the opportunity to make a lot more money in the future. It may not be right now, but it will be in the future. So I think that these results, while yes, like you said, they are mixed, I think the biggest thing is it proves the point that everyone has been saying, well, not everyone, but the majority of people have been saying, is that streaming is the future, and you really do need to have a good base when it comes to streaming in order to make sure that your media company can survive the future, whether it be COVID or whether it be other aspects that we can't control right now. Streaming is what you need to have in order to be successful. So another part of their Q3 results is that there were some questions that were asked about Paramount Plus, and one of the things that was asked was Viacom CBS they've been licensing a lot of their content. We actually just talked last week about how there's a new deal in place with HBO Max to get a lot of the Comedy Central classics like Key and Peele and the Dave Chappelle Show, Inside Amy Schumer. There's a lot of shows that are coming to HBO Max because Viacom CBS is licensing them. There's still content to this day that's licensed over at Netflix that does very well consistently on the service. And the question was, well, if you keep licensing your content off to the other streaming services, what do you have for yourself? And there was a very interesting response, which was basically they are going to be using their ability to license content, one, because they have a lot of content and they don't feel the necessity to keep it all for themselves, which is very similar to what Warner Media is doing because they're also licensing content elsewhere as well. But they believe that they have more than enough content for themselves. But the biggest thing is that they want to use the money for the content in order to create more content. So basically, as that money comes in from their library content that they're licensing elsewhere, they're going to use that money to create more shows, more originals for their own service and for their networks. And that's the big thing for them. It's a good steady stream of money coming in, which is why Warner Media was so adamant about making sure everyone was well aware that while we have every intention of getting a bunch of stuff on our service, we're not going to have everything because there's just a lot, and then what are we going to license out? And then we lose out on that money. So there's that aspect of it. But then the other aspect of it is that one of the things I've seen some people online discuss, but not the actual articles themselves, is that when the companies are actually licensing the content out, let's say, for example, something like Friends, but let's use one of the Comedy Central shows. Like, let's say Key and Peele. Obviously, they're not making new episodes. That show is still very popular online, still very popular with young people. But let's say it has a sudden resurgence and becomes extremely popular while it's on HBO Max. Well, eventually when the streaming deal's up, that content will revert back to Paramount Plus, which means anybody who was watching it on HBO Max is now going to have to go over to Paramount Plus to watch it. Similar to what just happened with Friends, where it was on Netflix, it had a resurgence, got very popular, and now it went over to HBO Max and is consistently one of the top shows on the service. It's just what happens when you have content that, has the potential of having a resurgence. And that can be true of any of the shows that they have, but some of those shows, they can revert back to their own service and they don't have to license them out. Meanwhile, they can use the money to build a bigger library because they'll be able to create even more original content for their service.
This was just kind of echoing you for a second, it was just a very interesting article for two ideas. Definitely for the side of, raising cash. This kind of reminds me of the idea of venture capital. Like you go to these venture capital people, you raise money, and then you go for your work. And Viacom CBS, they're not going to go seek that route. But this idea of selling off parts of your company, and an idea of a stock, right? You're selling off parts of this licensing. I mean, obviously the rights are going to reverse. But seeing this parallel of you're selling off parts of your company, giving up a little bit of equity for the idea of you're getting cash right now to help fund your business, and ways of creating new content, investing in infrastructure as they're growing out. See Paramount Plus, and as they add new subscribers, all those costs add up. It was a very interesting way to look at it, and I feel like that doesn't get enough attention. Keeping all licensed content, all content to yourself might not be the best idea. And that's kind of been the assumption in the industry for, a while. Of you see Disney Plus clamoring to get all these movies and shows back onto their service. And when HBO Max created their, streaming service, you saw that idea of why would HBO Max license content out? Like the goal should be that you get all the content yourself. So this is a very interesting, use case. And I'm curious how it's going to go out for the future of Paramount Plus, if this is going to be a viable strategy for them. Will it cause the necessary things that they're trying to look for? And, at the end of the day, those rights will revert and then they can license it out again. Or if they want to keep it to their service, and they keep it to itself. And that segues to the idea of their relationship with licensed content, because you can almost test some ideas out. You can license a show that's gotten some okay things, but it might get picked up on a streaming service, and then all of a sudden it goes viral, right? It becomes a big hit. Everybody wants to see it. It's one of those like evergreen type content, or it just blows up very quickly. After a couple of years, you still get a lot of people interested in it, and those rights are going to revert back to your service. And that's going to be a huge boom in terms of viewership for, that piece of content. And it might steal some subscribers or just get new ones over to your streaming service because you now have content that they've watched. So it's like free marketing. You don't have to really invest that much into it. So that's actually a very, out of the box idea of how they view streaming, as it does inject cash for the immediate use, but then it also can be a testing ground. It could also bring up viral nature and almost like, free publicity. Just let it see how it happens on another streaming service. And if it goes really great, hey, we might just keep it because it's a big boom. It was a very enlightening article.
Agreed. And then the other part of this was that they also stated that one of their focuses when they launch Paramount Plus is that they're going to be closing down some of their smaller services. Now, you might be asking, well, what other smaller services do they have? They actually have a bunch, but a lot of people probably aren't associating them with Viacom CBS. So there's MTV Hits, there's Comedy Central Now, they have Nick Hits, which is obviously a bunch of Nickelodeon stuff. They have a bunch of different smaller services out there. Obviously, they have bigger ones too, like BET Plus, which would not be one of the ones that they would be closing down because it's been successful. But the idea is that if they're looking at it from the perspective of, we don't need to have these smaller services. And to be clear, they did not specifically name any of their smaller services. I'm just listing off some of the ones that they have. But it shows that, again, they've seen what other companies have done. Warner Brothers has a bunch of smaller services that are now slowly either converting into something else, or they are being closed down, or in the case of Crunchyroll, they're looking to sell it off. So it's one of those things where you have to wonder to yourself, did they watch what Warner Media did and said, we realized that we could just add this content to our service, it bolsters itself, or we could license some of this content off to other places, and we don't need to have a smaller service that is that only has maybe 500,000 subscribers, maybe 1 million subscribers. We want those people to migrate to Paramount Plus. That's where we want the people to come, because that's where the content that we have is. And that's where we'll also make more money based off of what they're trying to do. So I think that is a very important point, because we talked about, leading up to the HBO Max launch, we've talked about the smaller services that are over at Warner Media and what happens to those as time continues. And despite saying over and over again that certain services were going to stick around for a while, we've seen the closure of DC Universe, or, well, I shouldn't say the closure, but the conversion over to a digital service for comics that's happening in the next couple months. They've already announced that. We've seen other ones take a backseat to the focus, which is HBO Max, because that is the focus for the overall company. It's not some of these smaller services that don't have a place it's not that they don't have a place, because obviously they have their own set of fans, but it's not worthwhile for them to have a service that, you might charge $8 a month or $5 a month for it to have, when you could get that same person to maybe subscribe to the $15 option and have, maybe 10 times more content, or in some cases even probably a lot more than 10 times. But it shows that Viacom CBS, they've watched what some of the other companies have done, and I'm specifically looking at Warner Media as one of those companies that they probably watched.
I know some people are going to be questioning this move, but it makes sense. Like, if the big thing that you're going to do is Paramount Plus, then you should invest in that. You shouldn't have all these segmented services that reach a very small amount of people. Just move them all to Paramount Plus, and then bring that content with you to Paramount Plus. It's a win-win situation. You're going to have so many different, with a bunch of different streaming services that a company owns. That's a lot of infrastructure that you have to manage. That's a lot of people overseeing all those different parts, when you could potentially consolidate a lot of those positions together. Now, I know that means that some people might lose their jobs due to restructuring or whatever, but from the point of just the business, it just makes sense. And I know that I've definitely complained, and I think I recall you've complained about HBO with Warner Media and how fragmented it is, and how the strategy doesn't seem, obviously HBO Max is a really huge part of at&t's future, but you still have a lot of like these segmented things happening. And I think that for HBO Max, they should consolidate all those pieces together into HBO Max. But it is nice seeing Viacom CBS learning from these examples and putting all their eggs into the Paramount Plus basket.
All right, so then moving along, we have nothing for Apple TV Plus, we have nothing for Disney Plus, we have nothing for Quibi. HBO Max, there is a couple of things. One, HBO Max has inked a new deal with Don Cheadle's production company for a dark comedy series. Not a lot of details on it except for it's dark comedy. And then the other bit of HBO Max news is that TNT, TBS, and True TV are going to give HBO Max content a showcase Thanksgiving weekend.
I don't know how I feel about this, announcement that they're going to basically show HBO Max content on TNT, TBS, and True TV during Thanksgiving weekend. I mean, personally, I watch football during Thanksgiving weekend. So what are your thoughts on this strategy? Do you think it's good, bad, or just indifferent? Do you think this is going to drive viewership to HBO Max? Or do you think that this is just people will watch this content on Thanksgiving with family there and they just move on?
So there's a couple of things. One, I'm not really looking at this from the perspective of that they're giving away HBO content, because the reality is, while there are movies, in the article itself, there's a list of all the content that's actually going to be available to be shown on the 3 different channels over the course of the weekend. Out of the content that's actually being shown, there is actually not that much content that is HBO Max originals. However, there's a lot of content that is available that is content that you can find on HBO Max. So, for example, there is content, the first day on TNT, Thanksgiving Day, there's a ton of DC content. There's going to be Batman vs. Superman, Man of Steel, Wonder Woman, Aquaman, which is the first time it'll actually premiere on a network, and then it'll round out with the first episode of Titans, which is obviously previously from DC Universe, now on HBO Max as an original. So you can find the first episode. So in some ways, all that DC content, if you were to watch it, you're going to then see at the very end an episode of a show that is exclusive to HBO Max, but it's only one episode. It's one episode of 2 seasons, might I add. So there's that. Then you go to TBS, and there is a bunch of movies that are currently available on HBO Max. The Lego Ninjago movie, there's a Hobbit movie, there's Wizard of Oz, there's Big Bang Theory. Those are all that's all content. There's even a Friends marathon. There's a lot of content that's just available on the service, but isn't necessarily exclusive to HBO Max. Now, all of that being said, then you get to the weekend, and there is 2 situations that make it a little bit more exclusive. So on TBS on Sunday, there's a Big Bang Theory marathon, which will be Kaylee Kuko's favorite episodes, followed by the pilot episode of the upcoming series, The Flight Attendant, which stars her. That is an exclusive, but it debuts 3 days after it releases on HBO Max. So I don't look at this as they're giving away content. I know that they're also showing off a preview of Super Intelligence, which is a movie that's releasing on Thanksgiving as well, or the day before Thanksgiving for this on HBO Max. But ultimately, I don't look at it as that they're giving away content that's available on HBO Max. It's more so this is a way for people to say, wait a second, all of this content is available on HBO Max? You know, if I watched Impractical Jokers and I watched it consistently, I would find out that, hey, this is available on HBO Max. You could watch all the previous seasons. If I was interested in watching more DC content, there's a lot of films that are available on, obviously, HBO Max. My whole thing is, I'm not seeing it as so much giving away as it's a really smart way to market the content, because there are people who are going to check this out. I can honestly say that you are not obviously the only person out there who watches a lot of sports over Thanksgiving weekend. However, I know from my own personal family experience, not necessarily Thanksgiving, that's not a great example, but during Christmas time, there are a lot of people who will literally just turn on a station and they'll watch National Lampoon's Christmas Vacation or The Christmas Story, or they'll watch, holiday movies that are Home Alone. They'll just play in the background. They aren't even paying attention, but they are in fact having commercials that, could be advertising saying, hey, did you know that this content is available on HBO Max? And I think that's what they're going to be doing. I think the other part of it is with Thanksgiving weekend, it's going to be very different than it has been in past. There's a lot of stores that aren't doing Black Friday sales as big as they have in the past because they don't want massive crowds because of COVID. So I think that more people might be spending more time at home and be looking for stuff to watch if they don't already have, a service out there. So it also goes in line with the idea of almost a lot of the services are releasing a major film that week of Thanksgiving because they want people to be tuning in, and they're going to be probably advertising that on the variety of different advertising methods to get people to, check out their service, because they all have an exclusive movie that they're releasing the week of Thanksgiving. And that we already talked about that last episode about how that's probably going to be true of Christmas as well, where all the services are going to be looking for an exclusive release of a movie as well.
That makes a lot of sense.
All right, so there's nothing for Peacock. Jumping over to niche streaming services, Discovery is finally planning on unveiling their upcoming service in December. They didn't say exactly when, but it's coming in early December. And I have to say it's about time, because because honestly, it seems as if they have been telling us that it's coming. They haven't given hardly any details whatsoever. And while Viacom CBS is coming in 2021, outside of the name and a little bit of details as far as, let me put it this way, every time there's a quarterly results and the CEO talks about Paramount Plus or the future of CBS All Access or the future of streaming at the company, there's always some sort of update. We had a couple of updates this time because obviously we're right around the corner of the actual launch because 2021 is right around the corner. But when it comes to Discovery, like every single quarter, he will sit there and say, it's going to be awesome. We're going to be able to compete with the likes of Disney and we own all our content worldwide and it's going to be great and it's going to be huge. But they're not actually saying anything about what's going to be included, what's not going to be included, price points, tiers, availability, nothing. They're not talking about anything. And then hopefully come December, we will actually have all the answers about this service because honestly, as I've said in the past, I'm tired of hearing about the fact that it's coming and not actually anything about what is coming.
I completely agree. This situation sort of reminds me, I don't know if you follow or the listeners follow, Tesla, the company Tesla and Elon Musk. For the longest time, he was promising the Model 3 and it just, every quarter just, hey, it's going to come. It's going to be awesome. But it's Elon. Like he convinced investors to still invest in the company, even though they basically had nothing to show for it. Discovery's not, Tesla. Like the CEO of Discovery is not Elon Musk. He just can't drive that same excitement. So for the longest time, we keep hearing about Discovery, and it hasn't really, it just hasn't been a thing. And unfortunately, I think that's going to hurt them just because they're like, oh, okay, Discovery's finally doing a streaming service. I guess I'll go. Like, I don't know. I feel like this is just a bad news for Discovery. They should have just announced that they're going to do a streaming service, I guess, right now, instead of releasing this news just many months ago. I don't even remember now. Just so we keep, I don't even know why we kept talking about Discovery when I think we both privately know that they were never going to release a streaming service into 2021.
I think it'll end up rolling out and they'll probably say it'll roll out before the summer, and I would expect like a May release for it because it just, at this point in time, if they actually had something materializing to the point where they had a release right around the corner, then we would have heard more details and we would have been starting marketing pushes. It's too late in the year to have it release in 2020. But I will say when they finally announce it, hopefully it's everything that the CEO has been, making it out to be, because while I'm not disagreeing that Discovery has a large library of content, they do have a lot of content that people really do like commit to watching on a regular basis. I will say, however, that there's already versions of a lot of different of their offerings. They already have TLC and HGTV and Discovery proper. They already have streaming services that you can subscribe to. So the fact that we haven't heard anything about the new offering, but it's supposed to include all of this stuff that's already existing, it's like the consolidation of a bunch of things that already exist, which is maybe why they're not viewing it as such a big deal. But I don't know. We'll see. All right, the next bit of news is that Bloomberg has launched a streaming news network.
Why? Why would you do this? The news is, right, the news still drives viewership, especially the last 4 years. Any network has definitely increased their viewership due to the last 4 years. But I digress. I don't understand why Bloomberg's doing this. Yeah, people watch the news. People watch clips of the news. People read the news. But why are you going to have a streaming service that's going to air 24/7 news coverage? Like, how many people are honestly going to check that out? I have no clue. So they should have just partnered with a different streaming service, and you could have had that win-win that they don't have to be the source of. They don't have to build out all the infrastructure themselves. Have a digital team to help manage the service. Like you could have just. I feel like you could have done this a little bit differently. I don't understand why, but the head of Bloomberg, he's a billionaire. He put $1 billion in a presidential race that earned him like no votes in the primary. So he has tons of money to spend, and that's pretty much all I have to say about it. It's just why.
All right, so jumping over to other streaming providers, Roku has hit 46 million active users. Now, if there was any doubt that they were going to raise their number of active users, I don't think there was any doubt, honestly. I don't think anybody out there was thinking that Roku's numbers were going to go down.
Oh, they definitely weren't going to go down. But this is great news, 46 million active users. Do you think that this is going to help increase leverage in their discussions with Warner Media in terms of putting HBO Max on the service and orchestrating the whole deal? We've covered that many different times, but do you think that this increases Roku's bargaining power?
Oh, definitely. I mean, every quarter that goes by, anytime they have new numbers when it comes to the amount of people that are using the service on a regular basis, that's always going to help. Of course, the part that wouldn't help is if the numbers were going down or they were plateauing, but if they continuously rise, then Roku as a company has a very solid base that continues to grow. So, of course, when it comes to those negotiations to get HBO Max on the service, it is going to be one of those things where it's only going to help Roku. This is not something that helps Warner Media. If anything, this actually hurts Warner Media because it proves that they're missing out on a large subscriber base, potential subscriber base that use Rokus and don't have any other device. All right, so then this isn't specifically related to streaming, but I put it in the show notes because it deals with a lot of what we've talked about in the past. at&t is currently looking to sell a stake in DirecTV. Now, among other conversations, we have talked about how DirecTV makes the most sense for at&t to actually offload, but there actually is a catch with that, and they're actually offering a stake in at&t TV Now, which is obviously their streaming option that they're currently offering, as well as at&t Uverse, which is their current cable option that they have as well. Now, there's also word on the street that at&t is looking to get out of pay TV altogether, and this is one of the ways, and this is why they're actually offering part of their cable side as well as part of their streaming TV as well, because they just realized that this is not the business they really want to be in. They want to focus specifically on expanding their 5G networks. They want to specifically focus on building infrastructure when it comes to the fiber land networks, and they also want to then obviously focus on HBO Max as their media option. When it comes to certain things with pay TV, they realize that everything points to this going down. And we've talked about this on a multitude of different episodes. We've talked about how pay TV is not a really sound business to remain in, and I will say it's surprising though that they are, like, obviously DirecTV trying to get rid of it is going to be difficult as it is, because they already tried to kind of merge Dish Network and DirecTV a couple years ago, tried to get approval for that didn't happen, and now it's going to become even less likely to happen, and now even more so, there's just not a whole lot of options available to get DirecTV out of that company. I mean, other than just basically folding completely, but that's not an option that they want to deal with. So ultimately it comes down to they want to get rid of DirecTV, and maybe their only option is to get rid of DirecTV by giving away portions of their other business.
This makes complete sense. We've seen this pattern play out in how they've organized and just rallied around HBO Max. But if you look at all the businesses that at&t is a part of, and you look at the landscape of the 2020 economy and how things are moving forward, people are not the old ways of business with satellite TV and then just cable. It's just moving away from that. It's just not how things are going to go. You see more people utilizing streaming services. You see more people using the internet for a lot more different things as their primary medium to get any type of information, like videos. You see a lot more in terms of, using online storage of like Dropbox, Google Drive. It's just the internet has become the central hub of the modern economy. And so it is right to invest in those things. You see, especially in the United States, there are a lot of areas still that do not have high-speed internet access, not even just to mention fiber. So this is a big area where they could definitely grow in terms of just getting, new customers. People are moving in this direction. There's a lot of space there, and they should really attack that. And expanding HBO Max is definitely going to attack those things as well, to grow their business. We're just seeing just a shift of just everything. So it makes sense that at&t is going to move in these different directions. It makes sense that they're going to try to sell off assets as they can, or just, try to reorganize themselves to be more cost efficient and move toward different goals. It's just the way that at&t has to operate. And yes, it does have the benefit of potentially lowering their debt, but I don't think that this is solely just meant to tackle their debt. I think it's to move the company to a better position in the marketplace, a better financial position for the future, and really make them just evolve to 2020. I think if you want to compare at&t to Comcast, I think at&t is doing better, at least talking about how they're trying to renovate themselves. I think Comcast is a huge company with a lot of things that they own, but it doesn't seem like they are trying to actively undergo this type of reform. Whereas in at&t, it's huge, but they're trying to. They recognize their weaknesses and they're trying to move forward. So this was a great article because it shows how at&t is viewing HBO Max and all the supporting businesses they have that can help facilitate HBO Max. Because if you're going to watch 4K, HDR content, you need a lot of bandwidth. You need a lot of speed. Obviously, they can invest in high-speed internet, but even 4K, even fiber will definitely help this whole entire experience. So they're definitely complementary businesses that they're trying to move forward, because a lot of the other businesses are not complementary to where they are trying to go.
Moving into some of our secondary discussions, there's one article that kind of piggybacks right on top of what we were just talking about. There was an article that popped up at Bloomberg. We're not going to cover it in depth, but it was talking about how at&t has been having some trouble with selling off some of its parts. Obviously, we've talked about this multiple times in the past. It was just interesting to see some of the actual issues with some of the little divisions within at&t that they've looked to sell. Obviously, Crunchyroll seems to be moving forward with the sale with Sony, even though we haven't heard any more details on it for a while. But then there was also, like we talked about, Warner Brothers Interactive Entertainment that they talked about selling, but now they've taken it off the table. We are now hearing, obviously, about DirecTV. Xandr was out there as one of the potential things that they were looking to sell, even though that was a huge part of kind of what they said was going to work within HBO Max. But outside of the fact that that's an ad business and the ad business doesn't really work within a service that doesn't have an ad-supported version yet, the other side of it was the data and how the data was going to be able to go towards the people who are licensing content to them. So there's a lot of different things within at&t. These are just articles I would suggest checking out. So this is one over at Bloomberg. It's in the show notes. The next one is on Variety. It's actually part of their VIP side of their website. But on Variety, they actually had a list of all the top films that have actually released on streaming video services over the past year, and Hamilton continues to stay at the top of that. This is just data within the top most watched films that have released within 7 days of the release. So obviously there are certain films that released on Netflix that did very well, that Netflix touted did very well. However, they only had 7 days to get numbers to make this list and to have a specific number. Now, interestingly, Disney has actually a bunch of different films that have done fairly successful outside of Hamilton. One that I don't think a lot of people would even think about is the Phineas and Ferb movie that released back in August. That one is actually number 5 on the list. Mulan is number 6, but there's still a bunch of other films. HBO Max has The Witches on there, which released just a couple weeks ago. There's a variety of different films, but I would suggest you take a look at it. You shouldn't have no problem getting into it using the link that we provide in the show notes for you guys to take a look at. But it's a surprising list because Netflix, while they always have films that do really well, it shows that other services are having films that are doing well too. So definitely check the list out. Finally, the last bit of the last article that I want to suggest you take a look at is there was an article over on Adweek talking about how the value of the smaller services, specifically the niche streaming services that are part of larger media companies, has become something that a lot of them are trying to reevaluate. We just talked about earlier about how Viacom CBS is looking to close down some of their smaller services. You look at Warner Media, they're looking at either selling off Crunchyroll or shutting down some of them like DC Universe or some of the other options that they have. But then at the same time, you've got companies like AMC Networks, which is looking at Shudder and saying, this is extremely successful. We want to continue, this is the niche side of things works well. But that's because it's a different type of media company. And that's one of the reasons why it's been doing well for them, is because they're not looking at it from the perspective of having to have a massive streaming service that's part of a larger company. So definitely take a look at that as well.
It's a very interesting and enlightening article. I think the takeaway that I had is that small streaming services are able to take more risks than big ones. This is because, Netflix, and I think that Netflix is once again the king of streaming services. They are trying to, if you think of the Pareto rule, which is like the 80-20, they are spending most of their time trying to get 80% of the customers. They're not trying to get that last 20%, which could be all these niche things, like horror movies and other different stuff. Like it's very niche. So they're trying to appeal to the biggest, broadest audience, and they're going to focus all of their dollars to get the biggest, broadest audience. It makes sense for, these bigger companies of their goal is to amass as many users as possible. It just logically makes sense. But smaller streaming services, they're targeting that last 20%. They're more free to take chances. They're more free to invest in content that is only going to attract like maybe 3 million, people, or, maybe 10 million. It makes sense of how they are going. And I think it's good for the streaming industry that you do have these outlets. If you want very niche content, very specific content that you probably can't find on a bigger service, you can maybe potentially find it on one of the smaller services. Not every small service needs to be picked up by a big, company. Like if it's cash flow positive, like stay in business, you have a pretty good business. But even still, it promotes competition in the space, and you don't want all the big streamers to kind of all of a sudden become kind of the same thing of like we're all trying to be as broad as possible, reach as many people as possible. It's good to have targeted services to reach those people groups, because maybe they're not being represented in the data that Netflix gets, and if Netflix doesn't get that data, if it doesn't see that this block of people, let's just say horror movies, is a huge streaming block, then they're not going to invest their content in that. So that's why I think this article is important, is because it shows the value of small services and how they can help affect the industry moving forward.
All right, so with that being said, that is everything for this episode. Like we said, all of these articles that we talked about are actually on our show notes, which you can find at thestreamingwars.io, as well as a large list of trailers they've released over the past week. I shouldn't say large. There's a good number, but there's not as many as normal because, like I said, there was a lack of content and news releasing from the services just because of everything going on with the election. However, there is trailers, so you can check those out, streamingwars.io for those. Outside of that, you can also follow us on Twitter and join our Discord to check out the articles as we post them, as we find them, and you can also follow us on Instagram for latest announcements related to the podcast releasing. As a reminder, the holidays are coming up and we're going to be taking a couple of weeks off. Specifically, next week we will not have a normal episode, but we will have a special episode that we should be releasing talking about cable television and how streaming as streaming succeeds, cable television is slowly failing. So we should have that for you next week, but the week of Thanksgiving will be off for the week, so we won't have a new news episode for another 3 weeks from the time you're listening to this. So with that being said, that is everything for this episode. You can send us an email at thestreamingwars@gmail.com with any questions, comments, concerns, feedback, or topics you'd like us to discuss on future episodes. And wherever you're listening to this episode, please leave feedback. That is always greatly appreciated. With all that being said, for Tony and myself, this has been The Streaming Wars, and we'll see you guys next time.
Thanks for listening to The Streaming Wars. Check us out on Twitter and Instagram. Also consider supporting us on Patreon. Links can be found at thestreamingwars.io.